Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Phillips, and I'm an MA student of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Today, I'm presenting Perpetual Partition, Neglect and Abuse of Orphan Children as a Barrier to Peace post-1947. English colonizing forces left India in 1947 in a rush, a full year earlier than they had originally planned to, leading to the partition of India and Pakistan being a largely unregulated and brutally violent affair, as the new governments did not have sufficient time to plan how to ensure the safety of potential migrants. Widespread religious conflict ensued as Hindus and Sikhs were killed in Pakistan and Muslims were killed in India. In the aftermath of partition in 1947, India and Pakistan did not fight to recover what were considered their children the way they fought for adults. Orphan children were viewed as more difficult to reintegrate and as dishonoring for the conversions, crimes, or debasements that they resorted to for survival. Orphan children, whether lost, abandoned, or left as the sole survivors of their families, were living reminders of the violence of partition that did not fit the nationalist ideals of either new state. The narratives were hidden and ignored by the new governments of India and Pakistan, preventing true social recovery and peace. There's a sizable gap from the 1947 partition to when partition studies became a recognized field in about the 1980s. And even then, the field lacks research into the experiences of children. In 1998, Urvashi Bhutalia published The Other Side of Silence, which explores the experiences of Indian children during partition. And since then, Ilyas Chatha has published several articles mirroring Bhutalia's work for Pakistani children experiences. The great problem for most historians is a lack of original records. Because few contemporary quantitative records of children during partition exist, memory is the primary method historians have to reconstruct the events of partition from children's perspectives. This is largely because the governments of India and Pakistan did not keep adequate records, and because many records have been lost or intentionally destroyed since partition. Although the two governments faced countless challenges in establishing new nations and rehabilitating millions of refugees, their failure to provide care for the most vulnerable victims, allowing governmental and social neglect and abuse of children orphaned by partition, perpetuated the loss, trauma, and violence of partition, making recovery more difficult for the people of each nation, and embracing a silence that can be blamed for the continued lack of attention given to children's experiences in modern partition studies. But this doesn't mean that we can continue to ignore the stories. That would be a perpetuation of partition violence. Despite the lack of qualitative data, generally agreed upon estimates of 12 million people displaced and roughly 1 million killed suggest that the lives of several million children were disrupted by partition. People were dismembered, burned alive, raped, mutilated, and executed when their homes fell on the wrong side of the newly drawn borders. Children, like women, infirm, or elderly relatives, were often martyred by their family members, usually fathers, uncles, or older brothers, to prevent the dishonor of rape and or religious conversion. Others, particularly women and girls, were abducted. The exact number is unknown, but 100,000 women and children in total were considered missing just from Punjab. Usually, they were taken by neighbors or family friends and were frequently forced to convert to the religion and for young girls to marry into the family of their captors. From the beginning, the governments of India and Pakistan placed responsibility for restoring Hindu and Sikh women to India and Muslim women to Pakistan primarily on local police, social workers, and government officers. The recovery process ended abruptly in 1957 after just over 38,000 people, only about 3,000 of them children, were returned. The governments of India and Pakistan prioritized the restoration of women over children, particularly the mixed blood or illegitimate children who were born to abducted women, and therefore could never be fully Pakistani or Indian, Muslim or Hindu or Sikh. Because of the influence that the other nation had on their identity, they were considered impossible to repurify and reintegrate. When their mothers were restored, these post-abduction children often joined the ranks of other partition orphans. Unsurprisingly, many children who survived partition, like their adult counterparts, suffered from severe psychological trauma in response to the events that they experienced. In the immediate aftermath of partition, parents on both sides of the border filed official reports and published newspaper advertisements in an attempt to recover their lost children. However, there's a clear gender imbalance in parent searches, particularly in Pakistan's Urdu language press, because parents feared publicizing their dishonor by advertising that a daughter had been lost or abducted, although two-thirds of abducted children were girls. Orphan children, most of whom were girls, experienced neglect in refugee camps, lived in under-resourced orphanages, were given in state-arranged adoption or sometimes marriage to families that often treated them as little more than domestic servants, or fled from the government system and turned to crime and prostitution when no other recourse was available to them. Many children wandered into refugee camps alone or were abandoned there. These were mostly girls. The governments of India and Pakistan could not adequately respond to the refugee crisis triggered by partition, and displaced persons, particularly children, paid for this failure with their lives. Many thousands of children who were orphaned by partition simply disappeared, dying from a lack of care or being abducted from the refugee camps. In Pakistani refugee camps, cholera killed so many children that parents often asked camp authorities to put their children up for adoption just to get them away from the disease because it seemed so sure that they would die in the camps. In both India and Pakistan, some orphanages and homes were run by the government, but many were owned and operated by private citizens or relief groups. Social work was largely a private enterprise in India at this time, according to Butalia, and a lack of records leaves government oversight or involvement in these enterprises up to speculation. Caretakers struggled to provide adequate food, clothing, and beds, let alone attention to the children's psychological needs. Neglect of this nature extended the trauma of partition. Many children remained in orphanages until adulthood, when they were sometimes placed in a government job or granted educational subsidies. Both programs favored men. But others were adopted or joined a family through a state-arranged marriage while still children under the government's care. Initially, adoption opportunities were advertised on the radio in both India and Pakistan and promoted as a humanitarian gesture that would help build each new nation. But age, class, and gender could significantly impact a child's chances of being adopted and their treatment after adoption. Many parents considered adoption a form of personal gain rather than an altruistic act, and the governments did not monitor or ensure children's well-being after adoption. Young boys were preferred for what Boutelia calls legitimate adoption, while girls were wanted for what she calls other services. In Pakistan, Hindu and Sikh boys were considered by some to be more intelligent than Muslim boys, leading to widespread abductions and adoptions in the hope that they would influence Muslim sons to be more studious. It's unclear what happened to these boys if they had an insufficiently positive impact on their adopted brothers. Meanwhile, whether adopted as children or given in marriage as young women, often to significantly older men, girls were often treated as domestic servants, and many were returned to orphanages for acting too naughty after being, according to Chatha, quote, pushed to the brink of physical and emotional collapse, end quote. Even children adopted by distant relatives were not guaranteed loving parents without ulterior motives, as many families simply used these children to gain control of the land and other assets left to them after their parents' deaths during partition. Although adopted children, married women, and employed young men could be considered successfully reintegrated into society and evidence of the government's care, most of these children did not have the agency to decide their own placements in society, and many suffered from continued physical and psychological abuse that extended the violence of partition. Children who were kidnapped or ran away from refugee camps, orphanages, homes for the destitute, and adoptive families lived on the streets and turned to begging, crime, and prostitution to survive, often being bought and sold by gangs and cartels. India had little reaction to these children, but in Pakistan, after the passage of the Punjab Habitual Offenders Act in 1952, West Punjabi refugee children caught in criminal acts could be sent to industrial, agricultural, or reformatory settlements or schools. for up to 5 years, where they would labor for small pavement in prison-like conditions. Despite this effort to remove children from the streets, their presence remained significant enough to periodically spur debates on further government intervention, which were rarely actualized. The number, age range, and gender makeup of children who turn to crime or prostitution in each country are unrecorded, but these children, cut off from the already insufficient care that children in orphanages receive from their governments, haunted cities near the border as living, visible reminders of the legacy of partition and the perpetuated neglect of the two new states. Although reconstructing orphan children's histories is difficult because of the lack of records and unreliability of memory, research from Butalia, Chatha, and a few other partition historians collectively revealed that the governments of India and Pakistan, which claimed responsibility for these most vulnerable citizens, failed to meet the physical and psychological needs of orphaned children, the majority of whom were girls, making post-partition violence just as gendered as partition violence. The impact of this neglect and abuse on the formation of each state is unquantifiable, but engaging the work of psychologists suggests that the governments of India and Pakistan hurt themselves by dismissing the essential role of children in building peace. Psychologist Ed Cairns, who studies the role of children in political violence, argues that in cases of perpetuated violence, children are socialized into the expectation of abuse and learn to accept violence as normal. Cairns and others argue that children play an important role in the restoration and preservation of peace after conflict, and that adults must advocate for children and empower them to become custodians of peace. But children orphaned by partition could not even depend on adequate physical care from the governments of India and Pakistan, let alone psychological care, social supports, or empowerment. This neglect assigns a cyclical nature to the violence of partition. If children never cease experiencing political violence, they habituate to their circumstances and can never restore peace to their society. With thousands of their children perpetually living in the limbo partition threw them into, neither nation could fully move beyond partition. Each embraced a silence that lingers today, and the stories of orphaned children continue to be overlooked. From neglect in refugee camps and orphanages to abuse in state-arranged adoptions and marriages, orphaned refugee and post-abduction children in the care of the Indian and Pakistani governments, and their counterparts outside the care system, who struggled to survive on the streets, continue to experience the loss, trauma, and violence of partition long after 1947. Both states' efforts to provide care were ultimately insufficient, and orphaned children, who were originally upheld as a means of unifying each new nation, were cut out of national narratives, reduced to living symbols of partition that each state would rather disregard. Thank you for your attention. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime with any questions. Thank you.